The very first thing I'm going to share with you about me is a little bit of the story of my first colonoscopy. Now, in the US, colonoscopies usually require anesthesia, but as a graduate student, I was worried about the impact of the anesthesia on my productivity and on my memory, and I was worried about the time that I would need to take outside of lab to recover from the anesthesia. So because of this, I elected to have my first colonoscopy done without anesthesia. I was completely 100% conscious, and I watched on a monitor as a camera snaked through my mostly healthy colon and peered into my inflamed small intestine. Just minutes after the camera was removed from my gut, I grabbed my backpack and walked across campus and sat down at my bench to do some lab work. After about an hour of my lab work, I grabbed my backpack and I went to my biochemistry class. To say that I have grit is to state something entirely obvious, or at least I thought. For those of you who don't know what grit is passionate perseverance over time. What this means is you get back up again after being knocked down over and over again for a prolonged period of time. So it's probably not surprising to you that I would be talking about grit, since I'm a grad student and grad school requires getting up after being knocked down over and over again over a long period of time. In my program, one project can last 5, 6, even 7 years. My project is cool. I study mitochondrial DNA, and I do these things called PCR reactions, where I make copies of small regions of mitochondrial DNA. I use this tiny worm called C. elegans, which I've shown you here, mostly because I think it's really cute. Now, if you're not a biologist, you might not know that experiments actually fail a lot. And those PCR reactions, making copies of mitochondrial DNA that I mentioned, those reactions were failing way more than they were working for me. So after years of these failures, I got in touch with my advisors and my mentors, and I asked them for help on moving the project forward. I shared with them that I was having these experimental failures, and I told them that sometimes when my experiments fail, I don't really want to try again. I don't really want to persevere. I will know I still do the experiments, but when my advisors and mentors heard that I didn't want to persevere, they told me that I need more grit. Now, that's not all that they told me. They also said that I didn't seem very passionate. They wondered aloud if this was the right place for me. And they told me to my face that they wished that I were more successful. So with all these words bouncing around in my head, I convinced myself that they were right and that I just needed more grit. So I buckled down and I worked harder. I thought maybe I could convince them that I am passionate, that I do belong here, and maybe I could even be successful. So I came into lab more on evenings and weekends. I worked longer hours. I barely slept. And as I worked harder, this pain in my gut that I've had ever since I was a little kid got worse. I realized that most of the foods that I was eating were making the pain worse. And I found that eating plain chicken and plain mashed potatoes made the pain a little less severe. So for months on end, I ate only plain chicken and plain mashed potatoes. I lost 40 pounds and my gut started to bleed. Now, for those of you who don't know, intestinal bleeding is really bad and you should go to the doctor right away. Luckily, I knew this, so I went to the doctor right away. I told her about my gut pain and my weight loss and my intestinal bleeding. And she told me that I need more grit. Now, those aren't exactly the words that she used. What she said to me was, you need more mindfulness. You need to do yoga and meditation. She told me, you're being too sensitive and it's all in my head. One woman doctor explained away my symptoms with the fact that women's bodies are weird. And another doctor accused me of overusing pain medication like ibuprofen, which is weird because I never take ibuprofen. So now with all of these words bouncing around in my head, I convinced myself I just needed to work even harder. So on top of all the lab work that I was doing and barely sleeping and barely eating, I was now squeezing in yoga and meditation. And I was trying to convince myself that I could make my gut hurt less and maybe it would stop bleeding. Now, I'm not going to take you on the whole diagnostic journey because it was long and required a lot of energy and advocacy. And really, the point of this talk is not even about my diagnoses or about calling out individual specific people. But the point of this talk is about how all these people in positions of power told me that I need more grit. And the consequences of them telling me that were really harmful. I know that if I had just continued to listen to my advisors and mentors, I would have only gotten sicker. I want to note that they felt that I needed more grit because they thought that my capacity for grit was really small. And that's because they didn't have a full picture of what was going on with me. When I think about this, I imagine that they thought that I had a small gas canister of grit and that I just needed to work on building my grit allowance. But I argue that I have a whole gas pump full of grit. And there's a whole tank in the ground underneath that pump filled with grit. It's just that I need more grit than a lot of other people. I've told you about some of the challenges that I face when it comes to my experimental failures, some of the challenges that I face when it comes to my health, and even just getting people to believe me about my health. But there are other challenges that I face, and there are other challenges that your students and your patients face too. If your students and patients are from a marginalized group, they may be dealing with a lot of other invisible draws on their grit. If they're dealing with racism and sexism and ableism and homophobia and transphobia, they may be using a lot of their grit allowance, just making it to your lab or your classroom or your office. And there are not individual silos of grit for each of those challenges that I just named. There's just one big stockpile of grit for all of those challenges. So when it appears grit is running low, your students may be using a lot of that grit and you just don't know. And this is where the idea of grit can become toxic. Instructing someone to have more grit puts the onus on the marginalized individual to overcome systemic barriers rather than pressuring the system itself to become more equitable. And while you may be applauding me for the grit it has taken me to come here and tell you this story, this is unequivocally not a story in favor of grit. I grieve for the health and happiness I could have had if I were not told to just buckle down and have more grit. Now I'm sharing these experiences in a way that makes me feel very vulnerable in the hopes that I can change your mind about grit. So to the people listening to this who use up so much grit and are told that they still need more, I hear you and I see you working twice as hard to get half as far. I can't help but wonder what it might feel like to prioritize our bodies over our productivity and to burn down the toxic use of grit and the similar concept of resilience by refusing to conform to those standards. What if we think about our existence as an act of resistance? And to those who are listening who have power, I think without knowing all of the things that your students and patients are going through, you can't possibly know how much grit they have. So I urge you to stop telling anyone around you, especially those you have power over, to have more grit. I would imagine that they're probably grittier than you think, and maybe they're even grittier than you.